is day of a very acute stage of an ongoing genocide against Palestinians that has been, happening for the last 75 years. And this current iteration of really, really targeted violence in Gaza has been ongoing for 141 days, which is just like a horrible thing to have to say. And yeah, very important to note that we are not experts. We've all been trying to do a lot of research over the past couple of weeks to put on a somewhat comprehensive kind of first pass at all of this stuff. And there will be a slide later on that has some helpful resources with actual experts who have written books and are on podcasts and all of that. Really recommend that you go to the experts if you want to learn more after this. And next slide, please. Yeah, so our agenda is going to be this. So we're going to kind of start with a larger group discussion. People on Zoom are also welcome to participate in the chat of like general things that you've heard about Hamas to kind of get the juices flowing. Hopefully we can compare some of the answers at the beginning of the presentation to the end. Maybe some of those things will have shifted. And so yeah, we'll just give y'all a presentation on kind of general Palestinian history, the way that Hamas's history is played in that, and also general context. Then we have like a little bit of a small group discussion activity. We'll bring that back to the large group at the end to try and, I don't know, I feel like if you're just listening to us for 2 hours, that is going to be a little bit boring. So we want to get y'all engaged as well. And then there's going to be free to apply at the end. Which is exciting because I haven't eaten much. Okay, next slide. So yeah, we wanted to ask y'all in person and on Zoom, what are some of the things that you've heard about Hamas? It could be a sentence, phrase. Feel free to just yell it out. You can raise your hand.
They're splintered off of the Muslim Brotherhood, right?
Splintered off of the Muslim Brotherhood.
They're an occupation resistance force and an elected government.
An occupation resistance force and elected government. I know I hear the word terrorist thrown out around a lot.
On Zoom, we have they want to destroy Jewish people.
On Zoom, we have they want to destroy Jewish people.
The Israeli government funded some part of their formation.
Yeah, the Israeli government funded some of their formation. Yeah.
Maybe a primary focus on resistance instead of government.
Primary focus on resistance instead of governance. Anyone else? Yeah.
Israel created that in the 60s by eliminating most of the PLO leadership.
That Israel created them in the 60s by eliminating them from the PLO leadership.
So for jailing most of the PLO leadership.
Through jailing most of the PLO leadership. Anyone else? But they're comprised of very young membership. Anything else?
Designated terror organization. Lots of orphans joined them. Won an election in 2006 and have been in power since. Leaders live outside of Palestine, apparently.
That was a long list.
Sorry.
That's okay. I hope people caught that one. Okay, cool. Well, I'm excited about the level of y'all's engagement so far, because I feel like the first large group interaction is like really team, and that was so easy. Thank you. Okay, great. So we can go on to the next slide, and I'm going to pass it to Luna to talk about really Palestinian history.
Hello, everyone. All right, so I'm going to just talk about, early Palestinian history before 1948, which is the date that we hear about, and also 1948. And we have a full timeline in the packet, but we're not going to go over all of it, and we're going to give a lot of information that's not in the packet. So we're going to begin a little bit before 1917, after World War I. We know that there were Allied powers and Axis powers, and as part of this, the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, which at the time was ruling over Palestine, got partitioned. So this piece of land was taken by the British. So in 1917, Palestine was officially under British mandatory rule. And at the time, 1917, 94% of Palestine was Arab and 6% were Jews. We can nuance this by saying they were probably all Arab and different, identified as different religions, but just to give a sense of the fact that there were Jewish people from Europe that were there. In this picture here, you can't see it that well, but you could probably see it a little bit. Essentially, there's this British man, and he has these Palestinian men in shackles are being punished by the British. So this is just to show the power dynamic at the time. This is in the 1930s. So we know that Europe and Britain had colonized all over the world, and Palestine was just seen as one of their outposts. And meanwhile, Jews across Europe and the world were being persecuted, so some of them sought to create a Jewish state in order to redefine Judaism through nationalism. That's what we now understand as Zionism. And yeah, that was being talked about in different places. One of the places was Palestine, but also they, considered Uganda for as an example of one of the places that they were considering. Just a question, how does everyone feel about the projector? Should we try to make it more clear? Is everyone cool with it?
We can try and hook up a different projector that might be a little bit more powerful.
Okay, so let's hook up the other projector, and meanwhile I'll talk about the Nakba, which doesn't really matter if we don't have the map for it right now. So I think by now most of us have heard the word Nakba, but just as a reminder of what it is, Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe. Reminder: Britain was had already colonized Palestine, and was using this reformulation of Judaism called Zionism as a way to try to understand where they could build a state. And so Palestine was one of the places where these colonial people from Britain were like, okay, you can come and build a state here in Palestine. So after the Second World War, this is 1948, in part because of the guilt that Europe had for allowing the Holocaust, they handed over control of Palestinian land to Zionists at the time. And the United Nations actually aided in this. They passed a resolution to split this land into two states. They called one Arab, they called the other one Jewish. And that was in 1948. And yeah, as part of this, essentially Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from this land. So they were intimidated and bombed and forced out of their homes through forced expulsions. Their farmland was totally destroyed. Their groves were destroyed. Their houses were lost. It was one of the major wealth distributions in history, where all this really rich land and property and culture of a people were given to a different people in a very quick time. And we also should mention that Palestine is really rich culturally and very educated people historically. So these aren't farmers. There are a lot of farmers, but these are people who are extremely educated, who have built whole societies and have a lot of archives and literature and culture. And so this is kind of everything that was lost. In terms of numbers, you can see here, maybe you can't see that well, but 750,000 to 800,000 people were displaced. I think there was 1.5 million or maybe 1 million people in that area. So most of the people were displaced. A lot of them went to what now we know as Gaza. 13,000 people killed, 538 villages destroyed. There's a lot of documented sexual assault, a lot of documented just really horrific torture. A lot of people were in prison. So that is what we now know as enough, but which led to now like having a huge population of people who are displaced in Gaza who are since then looking forward and hoping to return to the land they were displaced from in 1948.
Okay, so we're gonna fast forward 40 years because this is a very, very abridged history, to the first Intifada. So Intifada means uprising in Arabic. It lasted for a 6-year time period from 1987 to 1993. And this first Intifada is taking place within the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Directly in response to Israeli occupation of these areas. And so the kind of spark that ignites the first Intifada happens in the Jabalia refugee camp on December 9th. And so basically what happens is that there's an Israeli truck driver that collides with a civilian car and as a result kills 4 Palestinian workers, 3 of whom are from this refugee camp. And this is happening at a time of heightened tensions because of ongoing occupation. And basically Palestinians then accuse Israel of this being an intentional or coordinated attack, which Israel denies. And as a result of this sort of situation and the tensions that were pre-existing, mass rioting erupts from this incident. And so, yeah, throughout this 6-year time period, we see a very, a wide variety of Palestinian tactics being employed in their uprising. So, we've seen there's a lot of rioting, mass protests, strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, specifically like the refusal to pay taxes. They adopted the phrase no taxation without representation, which I thought was interesting. Also famously, the throwing of stones. This is also referred to as the Stone Intifada. Molotov cocktails. That kind of paints a general picture of the Palestinian tactics. And then we see these tactics being met by Israeli forces at a disproportionate degree. So Israel deploys 80,000 soldiers. They use live fire, they use beatings, tear gas, torture, semi-lethal plastic bullets, detainment, all of these things. And so, in this first Intifada, we're seeing a very disparate comparison between Palestinian tactics and then Israeli response to these tactics with like hyper militancy. And so as a result, during this period of time, Israel kills at least 1,087 Palestinians, 240 of which are children, compared to 160 Israelis killed. So we see like ongoing in history already, the disproportionate loss of Palestinian life, particularly in comparison to Israeli life. And then during the first Intifada, we also start to see kind of a shift in resistance strategies, where previously there had been a lot of focus on kind of hoping that the international community might get involved, that if they could build up Palestinian civil society and provide those sorts of social services and kind of, like investment in their social development. That had kind of been the focus previously, whereas during the first Intifada, we see that shifting more towards political and military resistance, specifically against occupation. And then it ends with the signing of the Oslo Accords, which happens in '93, which Alicia will get into a little bit more here. But also importantly, can we go to the next slide? So during the first Intifada, specifically during the first year, is when Hamas was created. So Hamas is founded in December of 1987 in Gaza's Al-Shati refugee camp, which you can see kind of, it's up there to the north, right above Gaza City. And yeah, so I heard somebody at the beginning mention the Muslim Brotherhood. So it is important to understand a little bit about the Muslim Brotherhood to then understand where Hamas comes from. The Muslim Brotherhood was kind of like a missionary charity organization that functioned in a lot of different places in the Middle East. And they had originally focused on missionary work, social services, providing social services, that sort of thing, without as much of a specifically political approach to the question of Israeli occupation. And then, you know, during the first Intifada, as we're seeing a shift in, you know, overall Palestinian relation to the occupation becoming more militarized, there's a lot of frustration towards the Muslim Brotherhood for their lack of political strategy around this question. And so as a result of this pressure, they form Hamas as a political wing specifically for organizing resistance to Israel. And so, and you can see what the name is in Arabic, but it translates as the Islamic Resistance Movement, and then the acronym is Hamas. And another important context, I think, with the founding of Hamas is understanding a little bit about the Palestinian Liberation Organization, also known as the PLO. So during this period of time, we're starting to get into the negotiations that lead to the Oslo Accords. And Alicia will get into this a little bit more, but basically two prerequisites that the PLO had to go through in order to be able to enter those negotiations was to A, renounce armed resistance, and B, recognize the state of Israel. And so there's like a lot of differing opinions within Palestinians about this whole process. But Hamas was very critical of the PLO's decision to renounce armed resistance, and was also very like revering to what the PLO had been in the earlier days when they were first founded, which was very like militant commitment to national liberation. And so from Hamas's founding, we see that, basically like uncompromising commitment to national liberation, specifically through armed struggle, is like a very central part of their like political ideology when they're being founded. And then getting into today a little bit, I just think it's interesting to note that currently 85% of Hamas's fighters are orphans as a result of Israeli violence. And so I think that also just gives us a little bit of context as far as like where Hamas came from and, you know, where they're coming from today. And yeah, I think that oftentimes Hamas gets like separated from Palestinian people, and we have to understand that like members are coming from like these refugee camps. They're coming from families that have like undergone Israeli violence from settler occupation. So yeah, just general little beginnings of Hamas, and I'm gonna pass it to Lisa.
All right, so as Nico briefly touched on too, we're gonna go into the Oslo Accords, and these were like the signifying end of the first Intifada. The Oslo Accords were broken up into two parts. The first was signed in 1993 in Washington, D.C. actually, and then the second was in 1995 with in Egypt. So the two representatives at the table were the chairman of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, and then Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Excuse me if I did not pronounce those correctly. So the idea of the Oslo Accords was to first end the first Intifada, and then kind of like this new idea of coming to peace through diplomacy, negotiation, and trying to figure out the logistics of that within like Israel and Palestine. And then another purpose was to establish Palestine's right to self-determination. So the idea was the PLO would recognize Israel as a state, and then in turn, Israel would recognize Palestine's national sovereignty. I do want to be explicit that this did not establish Palestine as a state. And to this day, the international community does not recognize the state of Palestine. But it was to give them more self-determination in the land they were like allocated under the Oslo Accords. So only a very small fraction of historic Palestine would be given back to Palestinians, and I put that in quotations because as we see today, that did not hold true. So if you look at the map on the right side, it says the occupied West Bank. There's areas A, B, and C. In 1995, as part of the Oslo Accords, the occupied West Bank was divided into 3 areas. And then on the very like top right, you see like what is now today the Israel, and there's the Gaza Strip, and then it's Syria on the West Bank, which is what that land is allocated down at the bottom. So area A, 18% under Palestinian control. Area B, it says joint Israeli-Palestinian control, which I don't really know what that means. And all of the stuff I was reading never went into like details about that, so I'm not quite sure what that means. And then area C is mostly still Israeli occupied. And the way the process would work is slowly Israel would pull its military forces out of Palestine, and then like actual settlements were still to be determined. And then the Oslo Accords also created the formation of the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority was seen as a temporary entity, and it was supposed to be like this governmental organizational body assisting the transfer of like power from Israel to Palestine and these specific territories. So that was the creation of the Palestinian Authority. And then that was the summation of the Oslo Accords. Were the Oslo Accords successful? The answer would be no. They were wildly unpopular amongst not only like Hamas, but amongst Palestinians and then also Israelis, specifically like right-wing conservative Israelis. The idea was so unpopular that the prime minister who signed on to the Accords, Yitzhak Rabin, was actually assassinated for doing so. And then putting the Oslo Accords back into the context of Hamas, again, as Nico mentioned, part of the idea with the Accords was that the PLO had to recognize the state of Israel and had to renounce all forms of violence or armed resistance, which Hamas was vehemently against, because they felt like the only way to liberate the Palestinian people was through armed resistance. So Hamas saw the Accords as like even pushing Palestinian people farther away from liberation. And then the Oslo Accords seem to have also set up the stage for the Second Intifada. So they were supposed to happen over a period of 5 years, and final like peace agreements were never formally reached. All right, so then that brings us into the Second Intifada, which is the second uprising of Palestinians against the occupational force of Israel. So this happened from 2000 to 2005, although as I was reading about things, it's like unclear when it like formally ended. Some people even say as far as 2007. So there were like 3 factors that contributed to the Second Intifada. The first was the failure of the Camp David peace talks. So again, this was kind of an attempt at like diplomacy and negotiation. Yasser Arafat, who was also the person who signed the Oslo Accords, and then the new Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, failed to reach a peace agreement because of disagreements over the status of Jerusalem, territorial contiguity, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. So these were the things Palestine kind of brought to the table, and Israel was refusing to acknowledge any of those, and it was wildly unsuccessful, and it created more tension between Israel and Palestine and the political atmosphere in Palestine. And then the second thing again was the Oslo Accords. Tensions had been rising since the signing of them, just because they were unpopular and they didn't actually seem to enforce anything on like Israel's side of the agreement of agreeing to like recognize certain parts of this area as Palestinian land. In fact, from 1993, it is said that the Israeli settlers in Palestine doubled from 200,000 to 400,000. So the Oslo Accords were wildly unsuccessful in like trying to hold Israel accountable more, and so this was created even more tension. And then finally, the spark that kind of lit everything was Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and I put a picture of it because I think it's a pretty familiar image amongst people It's considered the third holy site in Islam. So kind of the context for this visit was Ariel Sharon wasn't prime minister at the time, but he was just like a politician within the Israeli government. He would become prime minister the following year, I believe. Palestinians had just had the anniversary of the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp massacre. So this happened in Lebanon and West Beirut, where the Israeli occupation force came into these refugee camps and kind of massacred hundreds of Palestinians. So they had just they had just recognized that anniversary. And so for Ariel Sharon's visit, it was extremely controversial, extremely political. He had brought armed Israeli forces with him. Of course, there were demonstrators outside, and once he left, these evolved into riots. And so I have a quote from Diana Batu. I got this from Al Jazeera. She's the former advisor to the Palestinian negotiators at Oslo. She said, Sharon's visit was the spark that lit up the Intifada, but the groundwork was laid in years before that. And although the Intifada was mostly nonviolent and was mostly like Palestinian civilians acting in nonviolent ways, nonviolent demonstrations, of course, there were instances of armed forces retaliating in violent ways towards the Israeli occupation. Israel had come back, as we see now, as we saw with the first Intifada, with a strong military force. It is estimated that within the first days of the Intifada, they released 1.3 million rounds of ammunition, and an estimated 4,973 Palestinians were killed. So again, Israel is just it's like having this like extreme use of force that arguably is unjustified amongst Palestinian uprising. And it's said to have concluded at the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, which is when Ariel Sharon, who's now the prime minister, and then again Mohammed Abbas, who is the PLO representative, kind of came together and agreed to like die down the fighting on both sides. So then from the second Intifada, we have going into Hamas winning the majority in elections in 2006. So there's a lot of tension internally between Palestinian government. We have Hamas and Fatah, and this diagram here, Luna created to kind of help explain, because I was really confused of like, what is the PLO, what is Fatah, like what is the PA, like it's kind of hard to make those differentiations. So from our understanding, the Palestinian Liberation Organization is like this overheading governmental body of Palestine representing the Palestinian people. It's internationally recognized. Within the PLO, you have these like political parties, these coalitions. A popular one is the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. You might have heard of that one. The other one is Fatah, which is going to have the majority of seats in the PLO. Often Fatah and the PLO are used interchangeably just because Fatah has always been like the actor of the PLO. Hamas is one of these parties, but in 2006 when it was elected, it is essentially ousted, and it is now has control over Gaza, and it's kind of like not necessarily affiliated with the PLO. So then the PLO and then Fatah remain in the West Bank. And the way this happens is Hamas is democratically elected into running the PLO. And of course, Israel and a lot of other Western international powers are not very happy about this, as they are like in armed resistance and liberating Palestine and seeing the state of Israel come to an end. I want to specify the state of Israel. So a lot of Israel's not in favor of this. So then what ends up happening is international interests get involved, and they kind of exuberate already the internal tensions between Hamas and Fatah. And this leads to a civil war of they essentially try to kind of stage a coup against Hamas. Israel puts a siege on Gaza as a way to like try to like get them out of their position of authority that they were just democratically elected into. So there's a lot of internal fighting. There's a lot of outside interrogation from Israel, the US, other Western powers. Tale as old as time, if you ask me, of the US not liking a democratically elected government and then getting involved. So this eventually leads to that split where Hamas takes over Gaza, it's the de facto government there, and then the PLO and Fatah kind of remain in the West Bank. Yeah, and that's everything for that. Any questions so far?
Is the Palestinian Authority set up to be both Gaza and West Bank?
I think. I'm sure,
Could
no.
you repeat the question? Just-
Oh, what was your question again?
Sorry, that is the Palestinian Authority and the Congress or the Council, does that govern both the West Bank and?
No, the Palestinian Authority does not govern Gaza, it governs the West Bank. And the Palestinian Authority is still like, I don't know if I quite understand it, it's kind of hard. It's not necessarily like a formal governmental entity, it's like this council that was created in the Oslo Accords to help assist between like Israel and Palestine negotiations. So I think like the PLO would be like the governmental body and the PA is like assisting from what I understand.
Exactly, and just to clarify, so the PA is Palestinian Authority, or synonymous with PNA, sometimes it's referred to. It's the administrative entity of the PLO. So it's essentially the same thing, it's the PLO, the Israel is in talks not with the PLO, but with the PA that is consisting of, and then of the PLO, which is the membership organizations. And the blue is Fatah, because it's like the most, the one that I have like the square around the blue. That's the one that essentially has the most seats, so it's the most dominant faction. Does that make sense?
Just one more thing to add is that under the Oslo Accord process, when the Palestinian Authority is created, we were like really talking through this yesterday. Basically, the Palestinian Authority is the authority that is doing the like I don't really know how to say it in Spanish, but the like basically connecting like the work of the PLO with Israel, it like happens through the PA. And when the PA was created through the Oslo process, it was given sole authority to the PLO specifically because the PLO was willing to recognize the state of Israel and renounce armed resistance. And so that's why they're like so intertwined.
So if there was another party came out of nowhere got super popular in the West Bank, would it be like competing against the PLO during elections, or would it be like competing against Fatah and the PFLP within the PLO during the elections?
Could you say the question on the mic, just so?
The question is, if there were a new party to be created, would they be new?
Would they be competing against the PLO for votes, or would they be competing against like Fatah and PFLP, whatever, within the PLO?
Would they be competing with the PLO for votes, or would they be competing with Fatah and other parts like within the PLO is the question.
I'm not positive, but what I would guess based off of my research is that they would be competing with Fatah and PFLP and other parties because these are parties. The PLO is not a party. It's like the internationally recognized, whatever is like less than a state. Like it's internationally recognized as a representative of the Palestinian people.
The back.
Sorry.
And the alternates.
In your research of getting this information, did you find any information in regards to the claims of Benjamin Netanyahu funding Hamas in support of creating division so that they couldn't get to a capitalist opinion amongst the Palestinians, causing like divided conflict?
Okay, so the question was, in our research, did we find anything suggesting that Benjamin Netanyahu funded Hamas as a way to divide Palestinian interests? Is that what?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's I'm gonna let.
We talked about that a lot. We honestly have all heard that. We were confused. It did not come up in our research. I think that when I hear that, maybe Nico has something else to say, but like, when I hear that, what I think that they're referring to, what people are suggesting is that, there was essentially a coup that Alicia just went over about after the Hamas won, in order to not allow that to happen, because that kind of goes against that's against Israel's whole thing. Like their whole thing is like, we're real, like we exist, like recognize us, and people recognize them. Hamas was like, no. And so then they were like, okay, make sure that Hamas gets out. And so I think that, I think that there's two things. One is that Jimmy Carter oversaw the election of Hamas in 2006 and was like, it was totally clean, like everything was fine. And so I think that was one way that it could be seen as like the US like supporting that. And I think the other thing is that just generally sowing discord in order to separate the leftist resistance factions. So that's my understanding of any suggestion about the United States or Israel supporting Hamas.
Yeah, in the research, not really. There was like this one moment where somebody like vaguely alluded to something like that, and my understanding of it is that like with the creation of the Palestinian Authority and then also designating Hamas as the governing body of Gaza, there is an interest that serves Israel in that, because basically like under international law, if you are occupying a territory and you're occupying people, then under international law, you have an obligation to basically like, take care of the people that are under your occupation. And so with the creation of the Palestinian Authority, with Hamas governing Gaza, basically Israel then like wipes its hands clean of that, because it's offloading that responsibility onto these like governing bodies. So that's kind of like the way that I've understood that. But as far as like specifically funding or like instigating or anything, I didn't see anything in the research that I was doing around that. And we were all pretty confused about like, we've like heard that and we're like, where is that coming from? Because in the research, we're not finding anything specifically around that. And like, there's maybe somebody in here, like on the Zoom, that might know something about it. Do you know something about it?
So I believe that Israeli politicians have said we made the mistake of funding Hamas. That there's quotes of them saying we did this and it was a mistake.
Well, I think that maybe we're gonna get into this in a bit. I did see something about funding, which might be this, but so like Hamas tried to ask USAID, which is the United States soft power wing, for money, for funding, maybe in the early 2000s. And I think that what this is about was the fact that they were like, we're really poor and we need money to fund our schools, our hospitals, our community centers, blah, blah, blah. So like, I don't know if that actually any of that money went through, but what that suggests to me is that they actually were looking for funding, and they were even willing to take funding from American CIA funding sources, essentially. So perhaps because, and we're gonna get into this in a bit, but because it's a governing body and they need money to develop their infrastructure, probably like, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Israel through soft power funding or through whatever other kind of funding gave money to Hamas in order to help them develop, and then afterwards like regretted it.
Also, what Luna just said, what that reminded me of is, because Gaza has a siege on it, a lot of the way they fund infrastructure is through charities, so there's a lot of instances of charities going through Gaza to like support schools or support hospitals, and then they get accused of like, oh, you're funding Hamas because these are Hamas run schools and hospitals, so maybe that's kind of also where all of this might be coming from. Yeah, it's a really interesting statement to say like Israel created Hamas and then add like no more nuance to that. So that's what we were trying to figure out is like where are people coming from when they make these claims, because it seems to be like lots of different angles and we also, the three of us, interpret it differently. So yeah.
Online question, if we're ready to move on to the next one. I had heard years ago that the leftist Palestinian parties PFLP and DFLP had been internally repressed, leaders jailed. Are they only now active in exile?
Lila Khaled did a video recently. She is the chair of the PFLP. So she has a more nuanced take on that. My understanding from watching that video is just that like, a lot of the governance has been jailed, that's true, incarcerated. A lot of people have been killed. And a lot of the air out of the leftist movement was, kind of like, yeah, just like suppressed after the PLO formally recognized Israel. So it definitely doesn't exist as it used to. You know, Lila Khaled doesn't live in Palestine, but at the same time, it has existed the whole couple of decades, and it's still officially part of the PLO. And in 2021, when they almost had elections, that were then just kind of, they didn't have them because of a lot of reasons. But during that time, there was a meeting between Israel and the PLO. Fatah was really pushing the meeting. The PFLP was like, no, we're boycotting this. This is like really fucked up. And so for them to publicly boycott it was like a really big like indication of, I think like where the leftist movements are, but also the fact that they still do have a presence.
Just a quick thing to add, it's actually interesting on this week's episode of the Electronic Intifada, they do like roundtables very frequently. They specifically go over the like fighting tactics that are being deployed right now by Palestinian resistance. And in one of the videos, they were saying how like it's not just Hamas fighters, there were fighters specifically from the DFLP that were being shown in these videos that are like currently, yeah, like fighting against Israeli forces that are like occupying Gaza. So, you know, like I don't know too much about the specifics of that question or like that history or anything, but that leads me to believe that there's like, you know, there's collaboration that's happening within these different organizations. And also, I think Luna is going to talk about this a little bit later, but some of the hostages that they're trying to, you know, be released in exchanges, like they aren't in Hamas, like not all of them are in Hamas, you know, so yeah, like there's that, but then there's also kind of like, I've heard Hamas is governing as like, quote, soft authoritarian. So I think there's like, I think some of that is used to, you know, like undermine the existence of Hamas as like a governmental entity. And like we have proof of like some collaborations that are happening like currently. But I'm sure there's like also complicated things within different factions and parties and all. I mean, that is always going to be true no matter where you are.
So I see that there's a little bit of water behind the West Bank. Two questions. One, does that lead to you know, like the ocean or anything that like international people could get into that? And two, does the West Bank, does the PA control imports and exports into the West Bank, or does Israel control those exports?
Okay, so the question was the body of water, that would be to the east, I believe, of the West Bank. Does that have access to international exports? That's what you said, and does it lead to the ocean?
Yeah.
Okay. It's the Jordan River, and I believe that's where the term from the river to the sea comes from, right? Anyone in the audience have an idea?
I think Israel controls all of that.
Okay, I think there was another question in the back.
Well, I was just gonna say that it doesn't connect to the ocean directly, like, you can't take a boat from the Jordan River to the sea.
Okay, it does not connect to the ocean, to answer that question. Okay,
Okay, we'll take one more question if there is one, and then. Do we have any Zoom questions, or we can? Sweet, okay, then we will move on. Next slide, please. So, now we're gonna try and get into a little bit, like, I think one of the first things when you hear about Hamas is that they're on the list of terrorists. And so I think that it's really important to recontextualize the violence that we're seeing being used within the context of armed resistance, because as we have seen like very acutely right now with the ongoing genocide, the focus on Hamas as a terrorist group is the like single most justification that Israel is using for its continued siege. And so if that is the reason, then we need to like look into that, because it's important to like keep a critical eye on these things. And so, basically just designating Hamas as a terrorist group serves to depoliticize and decontextualize them. It takes them out of like this very prolonged history that we've briefly gone over. And so then, it's another justification for like the ongoing blockade of Gaza. I just want to say that like obviously there are many moral and ethical questions to be asked. And somehow like those questions tend to only be asked of like certain groups of people, even though it should be asked of everyone. And like that's not really the focus of this presentation. The focus is to repoliticize their armed resistance. And so like in looking very briefly at Palestinian history, we can understand that like the inauguration of this violence comes specifically from the Israeli settler colonial occupation of Palestine. Like when we look at the history, when we see the British Mandate, when we see the Nakba, when we see the First and Second Intifada, and like all of the violence in between those periods of time, like that is happening because there's an ongoing occupation and people are in resistance, people are trying to survive. And so you can't really expect people to just continue in these circumstances without like trying to do something about it. And so, I think when we understand the context of occupation as being the thing that then is instigating violent armed resistance as a result and as a response, we can understand that like political solutions very much do exist to what we're seeing. Like Israel categorizing Hamas solely as a terrorist group then means that they say, oh, but Hamas isn't willing to negotiate, like, oh, there aren't political solutions. The only way that we can deal with Hamas is dealing with them militarily. And that's simply untrue because all of like the tactics that Hamas is deploying are strategic, and they come from this, very specific vision of like, ending the occupation. And I think also, we've talked about this a little bit and we will get into it further on in the PowerPoint, but you know, talking about Hamas as a terrorist group, I feel like people have this idea that they're like this weird, like small, radical extremist subsect of like Palestinian society, and it's like, no, they're the literal government, you know, like they're the governing authority of Gaza. Like there's just a lot of nuance that's being lost in the mainstream media. And so we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to touch on some of the more known violent tactics that are being used and kind of put them in historical context, and so that we can understand like where this strategy is coming from. And so yeah, if we look at the use like historically of suicide bombings, first I want to say that Hamas is not like the only organization that has used this strategy. The PLO, like in its earlier days before announcing armed resistance, also engaged in suicide bombings. And like historically, we have seen that this is a strategy that's been used to put pressure on Israel and the international community at large, not to ignore Palestinians, not to ignore like the violence that's happening there. And unfortunately, the only way that like that ever works is like really the only time that Palestine has been on the international agenda is when it specifically Israeli citizens die. You know, it's like when Palestinians die, that doesn't make national news. And so, you know, like again, moral and ethics aside, like we have to understand why this strategy is being deployed, and also that like historically the strategy has been successful in pushing Palestine into the international agenda. And then also within the history of the Oslo Accords, you know, as like Hamas is being created, that is when those negotiations are also starting to be underway. It's in like the same 6-year period of the First Intifada. And Hamas, I mean, like we can look back and say very correctly believed that the negotiations that led to the Oslo Accords would not advance Palestinian rights. You know, like they never dealt with issues like the right to return, the issue of like creating a Palestinian state and other things that the PLO have been asking for. And so yeah, like targeting Israeli streets through suicide bombings was also a strategy to embarrass the PLO, to say, no, like you actually don't have control over all of these like different groups within Palestinian resistance. You may have renounced armed resistance, but we have not. And like these accords are not going to serve what our interests are. And so yeah, just like understanding like where this strategy is coming from. We can also then like fast forward to the 90s, where suicide bombing is still being used in this time period. They no longer use this strategy, by the way, but and we'll see why. But yeah, basically they have this campaign called the Balance of Terror campaign, and the idea is to hold a war of attrition against Israeli occupation with the goal of expelling settlers in Gaza and the West Bank and Palestinian territories. This is before the blockade of Gaza, when Israel is still like actively engaging in settlements in Gaza. And so it's used as a defensive strategy, basically to be like, okay, if we target Israeli streets, Israeli civilians, then, you know, these civilians aren't going to feel safe, and they're going to call on their government of Israel to pull back from active occupation in these areas. And so also they like in response to ongoing occupation campaigns, Hamas would then like respond with launching suicide bombing campaigns. And so that was kind of like the idea behind the Balance of Terror campaign, but then this is happening right around the same time as 9/11. And so we see that this like very quickly backfires because of the subsequent war on terror. Israel is basically allowed to say, hey, like US international community, like fighting Hamas is basically like our 9/11. And so then they're given a carte blanche to just like go forward, re-invade any territories that Hamas had like pushed Israeli like settlers and fighters out of. So they re-invade those territories, and yeah, like basically with no repercussion because of the war on terror. And so then, and we also see Hamas officially being designated a terrorist group in this time. And so as a result, Hamas says, okay, like obviously this is backfiring, this isn't like strategic anymore. And so then they change away from employing suicide bombings to specifically attacking settlers within occupied Palestinian territory instead of Israeli streets, although, you know, obviously it's all occupied Palestine. And yeah, so I think like with this general overview, we can see that like these aren't random acts of violence. It's very strategic. It also changes with the context of the time in a way that like is extremely intentional, you know, and it's not flippant. And so I think that like understanding that context, you know, we can start to like complicate the designation of Hamas as a terrorist group without like thinking about where this violence is coming from, you know. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so quickly to talk about the armed resistance in the context of the blockade in Gaza. One of the more common tactics that we've heard of is firing rockets at Israel. And we have to understand this as a defensive strategy because basically, you know, Israel's like, okay, for our citizens that are living near the border with Gaza, like we expect that they're able to live their peaceful lives and just like go about their day or whatever. And, you know, Hamas says you can't expect that when our people are like under a violent blockade every single day and the circumstances of the blockade, it's intentional to keep Gaza like right above the level of humanitarian catastrophe, you know, so there's no room to really be able to like thrive as a society. It's like barely above that level. And so Hamas says, of course you can't expect peace for your civilians when we're like suffering this violent blockade every single day. And we'll see that like Israel starts to increment the restrictions within the blockade to the point of being like absolutely suffocating. Like, and then at that point, Hamas will start to fire rockets at Israel in order to force a ceasefire because we've seen that like Israel doesn't negotiate with Hamas otherwise. And so if they're able to force a ceasefire this way, they're able to gain the political leverage to then put demands to like ease the restrictions of the blockade for it to be at least livable. And so yeah, this is like very much a defensive strategy that's being deployed. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm going to talk for one more slide and then you get to hear my voice. So yeah, just wanted to also talk about armed resistance and the diplomatic strategies that Hamas has tried to use. Because I think like oftentimes Hamas gets framed as unwilling to negotiate or being unreasonable. You know, I think that was the word that Joe Biden used to describe like very basic requests for the ceasefire right now that they projected. But yeah, within the context of diplomacy, Hamas learned through the process of the Oslo negotiations, where like the PLO renounced armed resistance before going into these negotiations, that strategy doesn't work. The PLO, again, like none of the basic demands or things that like they had on the table were talked about. Israel basically didn't have to give up anything. And so Hamas says, okay, we've like learned from historical lessons that in order to enter into negotiations, it has to be from a place of strength militarily, because that is the only way that we are able to like be taken seriously in these negotiations. Because we've seen like what happens otherwise. So that is like Hamas's framing of like maintaining armed resistance and trying to engage in diplomacy. Whereas then Israel, the US, like Western countries are like, no, you have to renounce our existence before we do anything, because we won't negotiate with terrorists. And that's just like a full stop, like. And so we see this cycle being repeated. And yeah, it's important to note that like Hamas repeatedly has said that they would be willing to accept a two-state solution on 1967 borders. And obviously, like two-state solution, that is like a whole other thing. But given that Israel and the US are always saying that, Hamas is unwilling to negotiate or compromise or any of this stuff, it's really important for us to know that, because like accepting a two-state solution on 1967 borders, I mean, you can see on the map, that's a huge concession. That would be conceding 78% of historic Palestine. And so, yeah, we just like really need to call into question like the mainstream media's framing of this, because Hamas wants political solutions, and like wants to engage in diplomacy from a place of strength. And so, yeah, hopefully that contextualizes things a little bit. And now we're going to talk more about Hamas's governance structures.
Okay, so going into Hamas government, like we mentioned before, and I'm sure all of you know, Hamas is seen internationally as like a terrorist organization, and kind of putting that into the picture of like reframing and giving context. I've seen a lot of people kind of make the conclusion that like Hamas is a terrorist organization, Palestinians democratically elected them into this position, therefore Palestinians themselves are terrorists. They kind of like what is happening is almost deserved. And so this like idea of like who's a terrorist and why really plays into the harmful narratives that allow for the current genocide that's happening amongst Palestinian people today. So kind of putting that in context of the reframing. So Hamas is first and foremost, Nico kind of touched on this, whether you think legitimately or illegitimately, the de facto governing body of Gaza. So as the de facto governing body of Gaza, and then just pointing you to the headlines that we have up here, we hear this like narrative of like Hamas run schools, Hamas run hospitals, like this like larger conspiracy that Hamas is infiltrating like every faction of civil society to create essentially like terrorists against the Israeli people. And this narrative is really pushed against Western media. So Hamas is the governing body. As the governing body, they are going to provide and create infrastructure and services and resources for the people who live in Gaza, especially as Nico has talked about, because they're under siege, because they don't have a lot of access to resources themselves, because Israel as its occupying force is really harming them. So that's what Hamas is doing. So like this idea of like, oh, Hamas runs schools, it's like, okay, well, Hamas is the acting government, governments install schools, governments install hospitals, governments provide infrastructure. So a little bit on that. So Hamas is Islamist as compared to Fatah, which is secular. That's another difference between the two groups. And so what Islamist means is like based on the values and foundations of Islam. And then what this means, I have a quote. Where is this quote from?
The president of like the New York Times.
Okay, Luna provided me with this quote, which I think is like a really good succinct way of like describing like what it means to be like Islamist or what like Islamist institutions are. So it says, when I asked Dr. Dweck what makes an institution Islamic, he first answered, not much actually, but after thinking a moment, he went on to state how the directors behave, attitude, motivation, humility, trust, application of application of Islamic values, saying Bismillah, Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim, before touching a patient, prioritizing religious and collective goals over personal ones, and having a desire to please God. So I think when people can hear like, oh, this is an Islamist institution, the association pushed through Western media is like, this is like an institution that's trying to create like radical religious extremists, but it's like, no, this is an institution that has like values based in Islam, because I mean, the majority of the people they're serving are Muslim, but it is, yeah, it is not like religious extremists. It is just like, this is the foundation of like how we're operating. And the book I was reading to prepare for this is called Hamas and Civil Society. A lot of the times, like the people who, you know, help work with schools and hospitals and things like that, they're kind of asked like, what does it mean to be like Islamist? And a lot of the times I'll hear them say like, oh, like I'm helping people and I'm doing work, and that was enough for me to consider this like an Islamic institution. So that's just to give a little bit more context to like, oh, this isn't like schools that part of this bigger conspiracy theory trying to like create religious extremists. It's just like, these are the values, foundations. We're just working to provide resources and services for the people in Gaza. And so Hamas has a long-standing history of grassroots organizing in Gaza, as well as providing resources. By the end of the first Intifada, they had established Islamic committees in every refugee camp. And the Islamist committees are the ones that help run schools, camps, and hospitals today. Islamic institutions provide anything and everything under the roof: schools, hospitals, housing, literacy programs, trade programs, specialized healthcare, women groups, youth groups, and then a huge emphasis on the governance in Gaza is around orphans. And pre-October 7th, there was an estimated 10,000 orphans in Gaza. And of course, this number has risen exponentially. I don't know what the number is now. I just know it's drastically larger. So there's a huge emphasis and importance and prioritization through these charitable institutions, through these Islamic institutions, on providing from resources for orphans, everything from providing schools to just giving people monthly like stipends and giving them direct funding and funding. So that's a huge priority of the governance of Gaza. Again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of what funds Gaza is charity. So there's lots of charities within Gaza. I believe the PLO also has charities that funnel like money into Gaza. Internationally, they'll accept money from charities, like just any money they can get and people are willing to give. That's what's funding their hospitals and schools and their infrastructure. And yeah, funding for schools is mostly based on charity. This is what I wanted to say earlier. Schools are religiously observant, but not extreme or rigidly traditional. So again, just trying to pull away from the narrative of like, oh, this is religious extremists, and these are just people living within Gaza. That's it for me.
Can you go to the next slide? All right, so the other thing that we wanted to talk about were the tunnels, because this is like kind of a myth or something that like really freaks out like people in the US and I guess in Europe too. So the tunnels, it's not like Hamas like created the idea of like popping out of tunnels. During the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese were using the extensive networks of tunnels to battle against the US Americans. Hezbollah used tunnels. Actually, it might be that Hezbollah taught Hamas how to dig the tunnels. During 2006, when Israel was bombing Lebanon, and the tunnels are used for everything. They're used for fighting and offensive, defensive, but also they have a siege. So this is how they get in all their supplies through Egypt. They bring in medicine, food, refreshments, car parts, cement, fish, sheep, people who are married in and out of the tunnels. And they've been dug and been being dug since 2007. And on the left here, you can see the tunnel, actually it's kind of like dark, but it's just really thin and it's curved like an arc above. And some Qassam members were explaining this to Al Jazeera, like why they're like built like that. It's because flat ceilings collapse more easily. So they're really like meticulously dug and engineered. They are millions of dollars to build. It's like kind of one of the only ways to make a living in Gaza, and it's really risky. People die digging them. And they have their own communication network. The John from Electronic Intifada talks about how they have like these like a standalone like telephone network, so that you don't, if Israel cuts off the phone or the 3G or like the internet, like it doesn't matter. They have their phones. This picture on the right, this is their primary reliance on the tunnels, like really, really old. I think this is from, I don't know, like a decade ago, that like screenshot, but this is, yeah, I think that we can imagine before October 7th that they were stockpiling tons of food to prepare for the offensive. And some of them are like more like this on the left, like really skinny, and then they have larger spaces that function as living rooms and bedrooms, bathrooms, kitchens, and it's just really intricate. And then they, ride motorcycles down them. So pretty interesting. The tunnels are the reason that Israel cites to not allow materials such as cement and wood into Gaza. So they'll bomb large parts of Gaza, and then they will be like, yeah, we're not giving you guys infrastructure because you're gonna just use them to bomb, to make tunnels rather. But then what has come from this is that like essentially buildings that are bombed just won't be rebuilt. You can go to the next slide. It's just another example of what's brought into the tunnels. I love this this quote from 2009. So this is the manager of PC World, a computer shop in Ramal. The shop supplies Gaza residents with computers and IT equipment that enter Gaza via tunnels from Egypt. And then obviously because they're like going through like such crazy conditions, they'll like come out like damaged sometimes. You can go to the next slide. Nico talked about this a little bit, but I just want to talk about the hostages. And we know that on October 7th, one of the things that happened was like a kidnapping of a lot of Israeli citizens. The reason for it is because they really want a hostage exchange, and they are mainly prioritizing civilians who are hostages in Israeli prisons. Both West Bank people and people in Gaza. These people are in egregious conditions. Last 2 weeks ago, the United Nations said that they have proof, and they corroborate the documented sexual assaults of Israeli detention center police on Palestinian women. A lot of these prisoners are held indefinitely without trial. The conditions are like totally illegal under international law. Humiliation, torture, no safe place to pray, conditions like without food or water for days, don't have proper clothing for the temperature. So even if they were to release like everyone on Hamas's list of like release all these people, doesn't come close to like the actual list of people who are in prison. And we're not even talking about Gaza as a metaphorical prison, but literally the people who are in Israeli detention centers. There's so many of them, it's just like a small percentage of them. But some of the people that they want to release are really like high up leaders. So on the far left, we have Marwan Barghouti. Now Barghouti is actually on the third. The second one is Abdullah Barghouti. I don't think they're related, they just have the same last name, just like Chavez here. Like. And then Ahmed Sadat. So I'm just gonna talk briefly about them because it's actually pretty interesting. Nico mentioned this, but it's like interesting who they're trying to like get out of jail. Like it's not just like we want every Hamas leader out. This I think shows how strategic Hamas is being in really in what they're asking for, and how strategic and actually smart it was to kidnap a whole bunch of people in order to get some concessions. So Marwan Barghouti, top like far left, he's like sometimes some people call him the Nelson Mandela of Palestine. Like he's like super famous, leader of the first and second Intifada, leader of Fatah, so he's not Hamas. He went to jail in 2002, and
like a lot of these, he still exerts influence from prison. And some see him also in terms of like the Nelson Mandela thing, like they see him as like the unifying candidate to succeed Mahmoud Abbas from the PA. So like Israel's like, we do not want to let him out, like hell no, we're not letting him out, because they know that if he gets out of prison, like it actually might be totally over for them. So that's Fatah. And then the second guy, Abdullah Barghouti, he's Hamas's like top engineer. So he actually, all the like really creative weapons that they're using on it for attacks on Israeli civilians, he built them and designed them. And that actually, I think, like he's like technically not a fighter, but whatever, they want to take him, bring him out of prison. He was arrested in 2003. Now Barghouti, he's an activist. He actually isn't like really formally part of any party. I think if he were to be part of one, it would be Hamas, but he was arrested in 1978 for killing an IDF soldier allegedly. They let him out. They had like some negotiations with Hamas in 2011. Hamas was like, bring him out. They brought him out, and then they immediately, like 2 years later or something, reinstated him on a life sentence based off of quote unquote secret evidence. Hamas wants him out, and this is one, like I think last week, Netanyahu was like, we're not letting him out because of the secret evidence we have, which is obviously like really like not legal. And yeah, he's like 66 years old, like he spent 43 of his years of his life in jail. And last week they assaulted him. And in detention center, it lasted approximately 3 hours, the assault, and one of his comrades got killed over the torture from last week. Then we have so we have Fatah, Hamas, like kind of unaffiliated, and then this guy is Ahmed Sadat. He's a Marxist-Leninist from the PFLP, arrested in 2002. Also like a really strong leader, and he was part of the 2011 hunger strikes that actually ended his solitary confinement. So he was like, for years with a couple other people like in solitary confinement, he really led or helped lead this like international, so it wasn't just in Palestine, this happened also in Lebanon or in France, I guess, like other Palestinian prisoners in other countries were part of the hunger strike, and they were able to get some concessions. So yeah, these are some, you know, people from other factions who hopefully if they are let out, they could, you know, either form a unifying government or just like be able to show that like that there's not really like the fractions that there were a couple of years ago. And then lastly, I think you can go to the next slide. I just want to talk about October 7th. So what happened in October 7th? We can first of all, I think we should understand Gaza as a concentration camp or an open air prison. And then when we see these images of people who are breaking out, we can understand that they're actually breaking out of a prison. And that is why it was celebrated by Palestinians across the world. There's documented evidence that it was a long time coming and that Israel knew about this attack. It ignored it. It's unclear if they ignored it because they wanted to use it as an opportunity, shock doctrine opportunity in order to like create havoc and get more land, or if they if they underestimated the power of these like fighters, the Qassam Brigade fighters. And I think that we can just see this as, I think overall, like successful. This is probably contested, but it is successful in bringing the issue of Palestine back into global politics and transforming the status quo of international support of Israel. I saw Mohammed Al-Kurd speak in September, I think, or maybe August, but it was like a month before this happened. And someone asked him like, what do you think of like, how do you think about the like Palestinian movement? He's also not a part of Hamas, he's not a part of any party, but he said, the fact that Saudi Arabia is normalizing is like a huge problem. If that happens, this like might be totally over for us. Like we cannot let that happen. People don't care. They're normalizing. It's like over for us if that happens. What Hamas did or the Qassam Brigade did was not. They stopped that from happening. That we can never go back to how it was September 2023.
So they brought the issue back of Palestine back into global politics. They're pushing from a framework of national liberation, which I think that we can is being more national. Their framework of national liberation is being more understood globally, and unfortunately, the reason is because of the hostages that they took and the death of Israeli citizens. Because we know that Palestinians have been getting killed and bombed for decades, and it's not really in the global agenda. But as soon as there is a large number of Israelis who died, now we have to pay attention. That's sort of what happened. And Hamas is also forcing some sort of resolution with this. They've also scattered settlers and made settlers feel not at home, specifically, like especially in northern Israel, close to the Lebanon border. And I guess I hope that we'll talk about that at the next event around Hezbollah. But definitely they have actually engaged in decolonization by making settlers go back to where they're from in Long Island. And then the last thing is, sorry, I'm like kind of did this out of order, but the goals was like one of the main goals was to uplift Palestinian voices and upend the idea that Hamas and Palestinian armed struggle cannot be contained or can be contained. So another aspect of this is the fact that they are working with other factions, like Nico mentioned, both in Gaza, but also, and we thinking about like Hezbollah as well, but also in refugee camps in the West Bank, there are a lot of smaller factions that are inspired by Hamas, as militant as Hamas, who are now actually fighting against like the settlers in the West Bank. Palestinians are still bearing the brunt within armed resistance because as a response, there has been an acute uptick in the genocide and ethnic cleansing, but the alternative in Hamas's view is slow death. And I think that we can probably agree with some part of that, if not all of that. The last thing I want to say is that I guess we should give an update on Rafah, which is being ethnically cleansed right now. They're bombing Rafah, where they have asked everyone to go to. Meanwhile, Egypt is maybe like building a little bit of a wall outside of Rafah and the Sinai, which is against the negotiation terms and has made Hamas be a little bit upset. So we heard, I think last week, that there was like a stymie in the like negotiations, and part of it came because Hamas got some insight that Egypt was building this wall, and they were like, that's not what we agreed to. No, like you're in bad faith. So yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. This is, the last slide. In the process of decolonization, there's a distinction between violence and armed resistance. And I hope that some of what we've shared today can aid towards this thesis. And you can go to the next slide. We're gonna have an activity in small groups. Maybe we'll split to 3 or 4 here, and then
I was gonna see, since it's 3:30, what do you think about we do Frito pie and then while we're eating, hanging out outside, we do our little discussion? Does that?
We could start the groups online while folks are getting food and then have conversation there as well. If you want.
okay, so these are some questions we have, and then we have like some articles that we can just like consider. So the main, questions are like important points that came up in analysis or discussion, questions that were raised. What are some common misconceptions we hear about Hamas, and why are these ideas encouraged by like Americans in the West? What is our role as people in the US in terms of supporting Palestinian liberation? And then you can go to the next slide. We have like these 2 like pieces of media that we want people to consider. I think that we can all probably, I'm gonna assume that everyone in this room and in the Zoom room probably are against like Fox News and CNN and like how they're like, oh, the Palestinians deserve this or whatever. But I think that we, as people who are like leftists or liberals or whatever, get a lot of like media that's more about like, hey, can we just acknowledge that both sides are bad? So that's kind of what the media is about today that I think we should consider and encourage people to just think about. So I'll just like, I put more of it in the packet, like in depth, but just like I think the two main paragraphs from the article are here. Why launch a destructive war that annihilates your people and destroy your territories only to demand that Gaza back to what it was before you drag Gazans along with your suicidal adventures? There's a tiny, reed-thin chance that something better might come out of this horror show of a war. To grasp it, the Palestinians need to be free of Hamas and Israelis free of Netanyahu. Every day those men remain in power is a curse on both people who have surely been cursed long enough. So that's the article from The Guardian from a couple of weeks ago that we can just consider. And then you can go to the next slide. This is like a tweet. I'll just let you read this later because it's kind of word salad, but essentially it's this person saying people who are explicitly pro-Hamas are by any means leftists, and they're the same as like extreme Zionists. So the question that we can consider together is, what are some of the views being represented in the article and the tweet, and how do they fall short? Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? So I'm gonna do the rest of the PowerPoint really quick. It's like 2 more slides, and then we can get Frito pie. And then because we're in a surge, and if we all eat in here, it kind of, defeats the purpose of masking. We're gonna eat outside, and we'll do the discussion group outside. And we can do 2 groups, see how that goes. So we'll do odds and evens. So once you've served yourself, find odds and evens outside. Okay, great. And then, there is a list of helpful resources that we did a lot of research from. So feel free to take a picture of it in case that is interesting. Speak really, really slow while people take pictures. And then, basically the last thing to plug, next slide, is the last, I guess, of this 3-part series, which is going to be on March 9th at 2 p.m.
1 p.m.
At 1 p.m., my bad. Either on Zoom or here. So hybrid again, masks will be required. It's very similar setup, 1 p.m. Sorry, I wrote it wrong. We'll focus on Hezbollah, so join if you want, share, spread the word. Okay, so great. We can Frito pie and discuss outside. Oh yeah, good question.
Can I ask a few questions? Is there space for more questions?
Sure.
Just 2 questions. One, I know that Hamas's most recent charter disavows anti-Semitism, and I'm wondering if anyone has any sense of like I get in a lot of arguments with Zionists about this, how realistic that is. Is that a real thing? Does Hamas leadership make that distinction for political purposes only, or do they actually really understand the difference between Jewish people and Zionists?
Okay, so the question is kind of, does Hamas truly recognize the difference between Jewish people and Zionists? That's a big question. I think the couple of things that I can say to that is, if you watch the press release that Hamas put out a few days after the Al-Aqsa flood campaign began, they put out like a very comprehensive list of like why they're doing it, like who we're targeting, like the things that we're concerned about with, like Israeli hostages maybe being killed by like the Hannibal doctrine and stuff like that. And like in that press release, they specifically talk about the Zionist project. They're not
talking about like all Jews, they're specifically referencing Zionists. So that is something to keep in mind. And then the other thing that I would say is like, Hamas is often accused of wanting to create an ethno-state because they are Islamist, and that is just like not true. They've never expressed that, and so I think as far as like thinking about different religions and that kind of stuff, it's important to just like clarify that. I'm gonna see if anyone else has a response, and then we can see your hand.
I think that what I've realized in the past few months is like to actually question the impetus for that question. Because I believe that, not your question, but I believe that generally it's in bad faith because it doesn't actually engage with the materials that put forth, the extensive materials put forth by any of these like terrorist groups, you know. They do read and they do write very well actually. And so I think, yeah, that would be essentially my answer, but this, even the question of framing like, are they anti-Semitic, do they understand the difference? Like, I think it's very clear even reading older documents that might use language that seems really like absurd and like bad. I think that the gist of the language and the spirit of it actually, I think we could mainly like all agree with.
And then in the back.
I just wanted to add to that, historically, Palestine had, what is it, the studies say about 5 to 7% Jews living there prior to, and they were living peacefully. So I would say taking that into historical context, it doesn't seem like that's the emphasis of the conflict that they're having. It's more like you said about the Zionist movement, taking their land. So my question was, has anybody had any more information about, because my understanding when the ICJ made their ruling that Israel was supposed to come back to support evidence that they're abiding by the 6 or 5 rulings that they had, I believe that timeline should be about now. But I can't find anything about what's happening with that.
So first, the response to the question beforehand was, historically, of course, Jewish people were living in Palestine. There are Jewish Palestinians. The issue isn't about like Jewish people versus Palestinians. It's this larger it's Zionism and the occupying force that is Israel. To summarize your response, and then your question is asking about the ICJ hearings. Israel is supposed to have a response to prove why they are abiding by international law. And that's supposed to be happening now, and you haven't been able to find information on that, is what you're saying?
Yeah. And I was wondering if you guys have any updates on that.
I don't have any updates.
I'm pretty sure that in the last roundtable of the electronic intifada, they go into that at the very beginning of the episode. They have like an expert come on and he's talking about the different ICJ rulings. And I'm pretty sure that he said that they submitted like basically an extremely lackluster document, and that the response is that the ruling that was implemented like a few months ago, they've basically been like, you need to implement this like ASAP. But obviously they explain it way better. I would go there.
Okay, any other questions?
Just really quick chat asked if we're gonna put these resources on the link tree and or something. We'll try to make them public, like the resources on the last slide.
One other question, and I also just wanted to point out that some of the first hostages released were Jewish activists who had been supporting Gazans, and that Hamas tried to release them to Israel. Israel refused to take them, and they had to be released to Egypt. So they're actually, I think that's a lot of evidence that they're not hating people for being Jewish. But I was curious what your take was. My other question is, I have no idea what the status of Hamas's military capabilities right now. And I know I've heard like differing things about that and that there hasn't been meaningful damage done to it, but I don't know if you have better insight on that.
I didn't know that first part. So the first thing was about like some of the first hostages that were released were from Jewish activists that were pro-Gaza. Israel wouldn't take back, so they had to release them in Egypt. I didn't know that, so that's super interesting. The second question about Hamas's military capabilities, I would just encourage everyone to like watch or listen to the live streams from Electronic Intifada. I don't know if you know about them. I think, you know, John Elmer, the journalist who really covers that, has been really zoomed in on this for decades, and they've been writing about the tunnels for like a decade or two. Literally, I think for 2 decades they've been writing about the tunnels on this blog. So I think that I trust what he says, and his analysis is that they are really capable. And like the one last week, or maybe like yesterday or a couple days ago, is about how Israel, I think, is like, they think, I mean, it's all just hearsay and kind of their own analysis because we don't really have real information from Israelis, but they hide information about how many people are killed. They hide information about how many tanks are damaged. They hide information about which reserves they're using. And it seems like they're using temporary reserves for people who like didn't actually like really like, weren't like professional fighters. Whereas Hamas, they all are professional fighters. So in some of the videos that he analyzes, he goes through like showing there's like these people who don't really know, like they look like that they know what they're doing because they're walking in front of windows, for example, which is like an obvious like don't do that, you know. So you know, and so he seems to be like, I think that the main kind of gist of his theory is that Hamas is very prepared. They've been preparing for this for years. Their training is extremely hard, and the IDF seems like not as prepared, and or they're not like really as like people are dying at a rate that like is not being shown.
What was the name of that, the guy at the phone,
Electronic Intifada does like a weekly or bi-weekly like stream. And the guy who talks about this in particular is named John Elmer.
All right, I think we're finally concluding to Frito Pie in discussion groups.
Wait, can you do the next slide?
Okay, let's Frito Pie.
Yeah, can we give a round of applause for the people who just gave us 80 years of history and an incredibly complex political topic to, yeah, I don't know, like about 80 minutes. Thank you all for joining. Again, there's going to be Frito Pie outside, and we'll talk more about kind of a discussion that we can have. Please join on March 9th for the discussion of Hezbollah, another group that gets completely demonized by the media, that it has a very complicated history as well. Yeah, and thank you again for joining. Outside to the right in a little garden, please join us for some food.